Hello, welcome to today's virtual Chelsea Ask a Gardening Advisor session, where today we will be discussing your questions on the topic of grow your own. Let's start with introductions. I'm Nikki Barker and I am a horticultural advisor at the RHS and previously a lecturer and manager in commercial horticulture. I'm joined today by Jim.
Hello, I'm Jim Arbury. I'm a horticultural specialist with the RHS with a particular experience in fruit growing and also a keen allotment grower.
And Jon.
Hello, I'm Jon Wheatley, a horticulturalist and exhibitor at Chelsea, and I'm quite passionate about grow your own.
And Lenka.
Hello, I'm Lenka Cooke. I'm a horticulture advisor for the RHS with interest in growing things to eat like fruits and vegetables. And previously, I used to work in the RHS garden business as a gardener.
Right, let's start with the first question today, which comes from somebody with no name, but it's actually quite a common question. So for someone just beginning to grow edibles at home, what are the top 2 or 3 fruit and veg with which to start? So we're going to do a couple of recommendations each. So I'll start with Jon, please.
Well, I recommend potatoes. I think for everybody involved, potatoes are absolutely fantastic to get involved with because they seldom, if ever, fail. And my other one is mustard type plant called Mazuma. We're actually surviving off that at the moment. It's a lovely plant you can grow from seed and you can eat the flowers and you can eat the foliage, and it's a really lovely plant.
And Lenka, what would your top 2 be?
So if you want to grow fruit, probably strawberries would be the easiest. Either you can grow them in the ground or you can grow them in the containers. Just they give you some lovely fruit. From the vegetable, you can try dwarf French beans. So if you are worried about sowing them yourself, you can usually get starter plants in the garden center. Just they are not too tall, they don't need support, just need plenty of water.
Jim, what would your top 2 be?
I was also going to mention strawberries. They're quick to come into cropping, so when you're growing them for the first time, that's really good. And seeing them ripening at the moment, should be eating the first ones end of this week. And also raspberries. I think they're one of the best value crops to grow in that they're better, far better to eat fresh than you can ever get if you've got to buy them.
Okay, well, I think I'd probably go for tomatoes because you get a long season out of them. And if you've got 1 or 2 plants, it's great for kids as well, especially the cherry ones. They can just pick them off the plant, can't they? And beetroot, because I love beetroot. So the second question is from Dawn Summers from Devon. As a recent convert to vegetable growing, I would appreciate the team's explanation of the purpose and practice of crop rotation. So I would say with crop rotation, planning is key, and the main purpose of it is to prevent a build-up of pest and disease and maintain your soil health and fertility. So brassicas, for example, can suffer from a disease called clubroot, and that's specific to brassicas, which are cabbages, kale, all that type of thing. So if you plant potatoes in that area the following year, they won't suffer from clubroot, so you don't get a build-up of disease. So, Jon, how do you practice crop rotation with your grow your own?
We tend to use a 3 rotation system. I think one of the key points, in addition to the point you made, is where you use roots. They actually do go down into the soil and they create a better depth, and they're better to help soil management. The other big issue is the legumes. The legumes do produce nitrogen, and that's a benefit for the leafy crops which follow. So generally speaking, I practice as much as possible, given the fact that we do a lot of our stuff now in containers anyway.
Yeah, and actually one thing to maybe add to that is that if you've only got a very small area, a small raised bed, don't worry too much about it. As long as you maintain your soil health by adding plenty of organic matter and not planting something in the same place next year if you've had a disease problem, you can still manage it. Right, the third question is from Barney Smart from Kent. hello advisors, I would like to grow a fan-trained sweet cherry on a west-facing wall. Can you give me advice on cultivar selection and any tips on care and maintenance? So, Jim, what would be your advice on cultivar selection?
Well, first of all, that should be a good situation to grow a sweet cherry on a west-facing wall. For cultivars, if you're only growing one, then you need to have one that is self-fertile. So I would suggest Sunburst or Stella as the cultivars, unless you've got other cherries nearby for cross-pollination.
And Lenka, what would be your tips on care and maintenance of the fan-trained cherry?
Just usually you would not do it, you would not start training the tree yourself, which can be a little bit difficult. So most people, they opt for buying partly trained tree. So when you buy it, so it just is nicely trained on canes. But what you need to do, you need to do a bit of pruning after planting in spring, because usually the central stem is left on the plant. So just you need to prune it out, or the tree is trying to grow into a conventional tree rather than a fan. So what I would recommend, instead of explaining this little bit complicated process, I would recommend looking on our website. If you just put into Google RHS and fan training, everything is explained in great detail.
Thanks for that. Right, so the next question is from Confused from Isle of Wight, who hopefully will be less confused when we answer his question. Could the advice team please explain the difference between the terms successional sowing and intercropping? Which is a really good question, because they are different things, but very often successional crops are used to intercrop, so they are interlinked. Successional sowing is when you sow something every 2 to 3 weeks to prolong the harvest and prevent a glut as well, because often if you sow everything so at once, then you end up with just a glut of one particular crop. So you can successionally sow things like carrots, so you get a long harvest period, but also things like herbs, things like flatleaf parsley, which I've got here, and basil. They're great for successional sowing and can also be used for intercropping. So, John, what do you use as intercropping in your vegetable plots?
Well, tend to intercrop short-term crops in amongst long-term crops. One of the classic ones is if you're putting one of my favourite plants in, things like beetroot, yes, you could put in amongst that, you could put lettuce in amongst it if you wanted to. And the whole concept of intercropping is to actually keep that soil, maximum use of the soil in the garden or in the plot, particularly with raised beds. You can work out short-term crops. We've got radish, for example, in amongst longer-term plants at the moment. And it's quite interesting to see that the radish have come on, and just the very short-term plants in amongst the longer-term plants are quite a good idea.
Yeah, it does maximise space, doesn't it? And also sometimes you can plant intercrop something that you know you're going to harvest the other crop in a couple of weeks' time. So you're sort of maximising the time that the ground is being used.
Particularly, sorry.
No, it's all right.
Particularly in urban areas, it's intercropping where you've not got a lot of space for people that are gardening in towns, and there is a real chance for people to grow their own. Then intercropping maximises that space, and it's so useful.
Yeah, and you can use things like spinach and the baby leaf lettuces and things like that are really good for intercropping. Question 5 is, what perennial vegetables would you recommend for the allotment? So Lenka, what would you recommend as a perennial vegetable on an allotment?
My favourite is asparagus. It takes a little while to get the beds established, but once they get going, just they will last in the domestic situation even good 10, even 20 years if you look after the beds. So it's good to start with crowns. Just you buy them by mail order, so they should arrive in early spring. So they plant them sort of on ridges and gradually have them up. It's better to let them grow and don't crop them for a year or 2 years on my very sandy soil. which is quite poor in nutrients. I had to wait 3 years before they started cropping, but we are not talking 17 years ago. So, and I'm still enjoying the cuttings. So if you wanted something a little bit unusual as a perennial vegetables, you could try Chinese artichokes. They make very whitish, knobbly tubers. And the advantage is compared to, for example, Jerusalem artichokes, they are not that tall. They grow about 60 centimeters, couple of feet, and you crop them from the ground throughout the winter after the foliage died down. So it's something unusual.
And they're not quite as invasive as Jerusalem artichokes.
No, definitely not. They are well behaved. So again, so they take a bit of space, but they don't grow 2 meters tall, shading everything.
Jon, what would you recommend as a perennial vegetable?
Well, technically, probably it's a stem rhubarb. I love rhubarb. I think that it's one of the best things to put in as a perennial. And then, of course, we move into the herbs, and you think of chives. Chives, absolutely fantastic, and really with boiled egg in a sandwich, you can't beat chives. And we're just chopping them to bits, and they're growing successionally all the way through. And of course, they'll last for a long, long time in the garden.
Yeah, that's a really good tip, actually, chives. I'm going to do that, definitely. Question 6 is from Matthew in Southville, Bristol. And he says, hello, I have a large round terracotta pot, diameter 50 centimetres and height 60 centimetres, positioned by my front door. It's south facing and in a sheltered spot next to a bay window on a terraced city street. I'd like suggestions for a standard fruit tree I can grow in it that will provide year-round interest and edible fruit. Tips on maintaining it would be appreciated too. So, Jon, over to you first. A standard fruit tree for a front door, year-round interest and fruit.
This is a challenging one. I think you're from the edible city of the edible bus stop, so you've got to come up with something really good for Bristol. I think probably I would go with an apple of sorts. I'm a great believer in using a plant that has 2 or 3 purposes. So you want to choose something that's going to have good flower, and I think you've just got to hope that you can get some pollination locally. I like to use something like Discovery or something like that, but on a small rootstock.
Yeah, it would have to be a very dwarfing rootstock, wouldn't it? So, Jim, what would be your recommendation for that?
Again, I think this you've got to rely on local pollination with them. I would choose a pear, Burr Hardy, because it has good blossom, lovely fruit, and also good autumn colour. Pears are one of the fruit trees that actually have autumn colour, and that would be, I think, a good choice. And Bristol's should be fairly warm, should be suitable for it, south facing.
They do have beautiful yellow autumn colour, actually, don't they? We do forget that, maybe.
Right. Sorry, mainly more almost red with Burr Hardy. Very good autumn colour.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, clearly my pear tree isn't a Burr Hardy then. Question 7. I would like to try my hand at growing large vegetables for showing at our local autumn horticultural show. I have never done this before. Any tips or recommendations for particular crops and cultivars to try? Jon, I'll hand this one over to you then.
Well, my friend and colleague Terry Porter, who grows all our stuff for Chelsea, he grows in good compost. We use a peat reduced compost, and where possible peat-free compost, and that's the key. And we found that we can grow them really well with in pots. Start early is the key. You do need some form of cover if you've got it, and bear in mind that with root vegetables you want something that's going to make sure that the soil is very deep and very friable and very clean for the roots to actually go down some depth. Leeks, for example, we're growing leeks in pots, and if you think up in the northeast of the country, they grow their pot leeks. But the key to it is watering and feeding. Good stock in the beginning. We get leek pips from up in the northeast, and then we pop them up and grow them on. And it's a shame I can't show you the leeks at the moment, but they're in 10-litre pots, and they're probably inch to inch and a half through the circumference and diameter.
So the challenge is not to eat them before they get to show.
Well, that is so tempting, because I'm having to keep my wife away from them, because I've got 30 of them down in the shade tunnel, and she just can't wait to actually chop them up. And I think I'm going to have to give in.
Yeah, you could let her have a couple, I think, couldn't you? Right, question 8. We have 2 plum trees, one espalier on a southwest facing fence, another as a small tree. Last year we had a bumper crop on both. This year, nothing on either one, but both look healthy. Is this normal after a bumper crop in the previous year? Jim, can you share your thoughts on that?
Yes, of course. One thing I'd first need to know is whether they've flowered this year.
It doesn't say, unfortunately.
Yeah. So if they flowered and haven't fruited, then it's probably a pollination problem, such as frost damage, which has been a case in some areas. I think it's more likely that they haven't flowered by the question, in which case it's probably due to them overcropping last year. If you have a very heavy crop, that stresses the tree, and it won't put the energy into making fruit buds, flower buds for the following year. So there's no reason why they shouldn't fruit every year, but it's important to thin the fruit. So next year, assuming they may fruit well, thin out the plums in June, probably early June, thinning them out to 5 to 7 centimeters, 2 to 3 inches apart, leaving the best shaped, best looking plums, taking out misshapen and damaged plums. That way you should overcome that problem. Also watering in dry periods. We've had a lot of summers where we've had long periods of dry weather, and if you get that at the wrong time, that can certainly affect fruit bud production for the following year.
Okay, Lenka, have you got any other thoughts on that?
It's not much I can add to that, because just that the very likely reason is that the overcropping, and the plums are particularly susceptible to producing masses of fruit, and the branches can be even breaking. So just it's not only the fruit thinning is often needed, especially on ordinary standard trees, for ensuring the regular cropping, but prevent the branches breaking. Again, just one thing you could do as well, so they feed with high potassium feed, such as sulfate of potash, which encourages ripening of the wood and subsequent flowering and fruiting. Biennial bearing is just not that, it's just particular to plums, also apples can suffer from it. So if you notice that on a fruit trees, one year you've got a good crop, another year's little or no fruit, it's a good idea always to thin after the natural June drop on all fruit trees.
So it's what you do the year of the bumper crop
that affects the fruiting
the following year.
So just one has to think so a year ahead.
Yeah, okay. So question 9 is from Julie Lusty from Wiltshire. She says, we are growing runner beans and wonder how to make sure our little plants grown from seed thrive and give us a good crop. So, John, what would you recommend for runner beans?
Beans, don't start them too early. A lot of people start them too early and they check. The other thing is, I often think dig a good bean trench. They like a well-manured trench to begin with. And we used to grow them commercially here, and we dug the trench and prepared it well in advance to the season, and put loads of organic manure into the base, and then just planted 2 around the base of the stem. Don't ever plant them until the end of May. We say here, wait till the frosts go, the same sort of time as you plant your dahlias. And then they're quite easy, really, but bear in mind they water and feed. And just as they flower, it's always a good idea to damp them down in the evening. We get it out of the water butts and out of the stream, and just spray them over lightly to help with the pollination. But generally speaking, those are the keys to a good run of beans.
Yeah, they do like plenty of food, and actually don't let them dry out. That can affect how they crop, and they like a really sunny position, don't they? That helps with the whole pollinators and things like that.
They like 6 hours of solid sun a day if you can get it.
Yeah, so hopefully those tips will help your run of beans to be successful, Julie. And question 10 is Nancy Rain from Buckinghamshire. For the first time later this year in autumn, I would like to sow an overwintering green manure crop on a section of my allotment. Can you clarify the process and purpose and recommend particular examples, please? Well, the process, Nancy, is that you would sow your green manure in an area that's going to be fallow for a little while. So that might be over winter, but it can also be at any other time of year. And generally, you would sow it and leave it for a few weeks, though some can be left for a lot longer than that, like clovers, and then you dig them in. So the purpose of it is for the green manure to absorb all the nutrient that might leach out of the soil if you didn't use the green manure, and then it replaces the nutrient when you dig it back in. What green manures do you use, John? And what would you recommend for an overwintering green manure?
Well, we tend to use clover for that. Sometimes it gets hit by the frost, but clover is the overwintering one that I would use down here. Of course, it varies around the country.
Yeah.
The other plant we tend to use as a short-term one is Espalier, which is a lovely plant because it flowers as well. Generally speaking, we never let it flower for the green manuring, but you get a little bit on the edge, which adds to the colour in the garden. So those are the two that we used.
Yeah, and actually bees and other pollinating insects love the flower on the Espalier, don't they? And it seeds very easily. You can also use beans for overwintering, so field beans, so Vicia fabia, and they do have some nitrogen fixing properties, so they can be quite good. If you can't get hold of them and you've got some broad bean seeds, you can use them and chop them in too. I think they're the two. Have you used the Caliente mustard 199?
Yeah. Sorry. We've used mustard from time to time, and it can work very effectively. A great advocate of green manuring. I think it really does work because it builds up the compost quality in the soil and keeps the soil growing and moving.
Yeah, it does make a big difference, and there are lots of different ones to choose from, but hopefully you've got a few overwintering ideas there. Malcolm Wiseman from Hertfordshire says, I would like to start growing plants for cutting and using in arrangements in our house and in our local church. Could the advisory team give any advice on getting started and recommend some good plants for starting a cut flower bed? So, John, what would you recommend for that?
Yeah, most of my life has been involved in flower arrangements and nafas and things like that, and I've been brought up with it. In fact, when I was a kid, I could never have a bath because it was full of cut flowers going off to the local church. So this is dear to my heart. I think you can start with some autumn sown things like larkspur, and we've got that in containers, and we're actually planting that out now, and Clarkia. They're lovely, both of those plants. And then, of course, we can move on successionally through with stocks, and then to the great cut and come again cut flower, which is the dahlia. There are a whole range of magnificent things, and there's some lovely books on the cutting garden. And if you actually look at lots of RHS articles on cutting and cutting for flowers for floral display. One of the other things I'm using at the moment, I'm looking at a beautiful arrangement of delphiniums out through into one of the rooms here. And the delphinium is a great plant. I'd never realized the value of it as a cut flower plant.
Lenka, what do you use?
Just you can start like in the seasons for the cut flowers. You can either plant some of the tulips or narcissus. If you wait, you can get the bulbs later on 60% off or similarly. So if you plant them straight away, there's a good chance they will flower. Also, you could, from the bulbs, you could use alliums. So just they are very good when they are in flower, or just for the dry arrangements. From the annuals, things like serines, just it's got sort of a nice glaucous foliage, so it's easy from seed, and if you let it go over, it will seed itself as well. Things like Majus is quite popular. It's got just a sort of wide, airy umbels of flowers. Statice, it's a bit old-fashioned, but both the perennial as well as the annual form, it's very good for flower arrangements, and obviously the annual one for drying as well. Actually, both will dry well. Things like chrysanthemum, if you want the perennial beds, just have a good clump. Just bear in mind when you buy them, check is a hardy one, because just there is a plenty of there's a half hardy ones which would be suitable for outdoor cultivation in sort of really mild parts only, but there are sort of a few hardy ones. So just that would be sort of like my little overview.
So there's lots of choices there, actually, isn't there?
And if you want to plant some sort of the foliage shrubs as well, if you've got space, you can plant Eucalyptus gunni, and just use it as a stool bush. So I just let the new foliage, cut it hard back, so we're probably annual or biannual, or just certain branches, and use the new foliage in the flower arranging.
Yes, and you get a bit of scent off that as well, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah, could I just mention?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, if I could mention some of the things I'll be growing on the allotment this year. From autumn sown sweet peas, we've now got them flowering at the moment.
Oh,
should have brought some along. Zinnias are also good. Yes, I'll be growing dahlias, so John should appreciate that. And also limonium, and I think we've got one or two other things. So actually, don't have them just in a cutting bed. Growing them in the allotment, they're fitted in with the other crops we'll be growing.
So yes, a huge range of choices there, and the sweet peas you can get fabulous scent off as well, can't you? So question 12 is Isabel from Edinburgh. I took cuttings from a healthy rosemary hedge last September, and they have established healthy root systems, but still they are not growing. What can I do to encourage them to get a move on? Well, Isabel, you don't say whether you've potted the cuttings on. So if you haven't, then pot them on into individual pots, because then there will be more feed available for them, and that will help them get a move on. They do like plenty of light, so make sure they're somewhere with plenty of light. Also pinch the tops out, because you want those little cuttings to branch. You don't want them to be one long thin stem. And actually feed them. Just a general purpose liquid feed should get them going, especially after you've potted them on. Then leave it a week or so and give them a feed. So hopefully that will get your rosemary cuttings going. Anybody else got any other tips for getting them moving?
I think the only thing is, I think of the ones that we've just done, and they're just finishing flowering now, and they were taken with heel cuttings, a little bit of the main stem back in November, and we actually gave them a little bit of cover in an unheated tunnel, and they've come on quite well. The only danger of that is if you do overprotect them, they do get hit a little bit with the very cold temperatures that we've had this year, because we had some really nasty frosts here in Somerset. But now we've got them outside and they're doing really well. But I couldn't add to the points that you made about watering, feeding, and caring for them, really.
Yeah, and actually what you're saying about the frost, we had that very warm April, didn't we? And then the temperature dropped massively, and that has held some plants sort of fairly static for a couple of weeks, hasn't it?
Oh, the frost we've had have been the worst in 30 years. Two nasty frosts. But we used fleece for most of it just to protect them, horticultural fleece. And we did the other little tip, which was to actually wash the frost up, getting up at about 5 in the morning and washing the frost off. And that's a great help.
Yeah, and actually before we had the frost, I think it was on the Saturday here, I live in Sussex, it was 25 degrees on my patio on the Saturday and -1 overnight on the Monday night. So that's a massive fluctuation in temperature, isn't it? Which isn't great for a lot of plants.
No, I mean,
sorry.
Couple that with the heat we've been getting, the heat surges. Like we watered everything twice yesterday. Now normally we water on the nursery once. Every plant gets water once because we grow a wide range of plants. But nearly all the vegetables we were growing in containers got watered twice yesterday.
Yeah, it was very hot. Question 13 is James, location unknown. I expect James knows his location. I have a small plastic lean-to greenhouse for the first time this spring. Any tips on how to get the best out of it? I seem to have scorched my peas and beans. I wonder if they were too tender and the greenhouse too hot or humid. When is it best to water and unzip the front cover? Lenka, have you got any thoughts on that one?
Just this will be a bit of a follow-on of what we've been talking about. Just the great differences between the day and night temperature. So just smaller the greenhouse, so though it gives you like different dimension in gardening, allows you to extend the seasons both ways in springs and autumn, it can be sort of more difficult to control the temperature smaller the greenhouse or the cover is. So ventilation is absolutely essential. With the small one, just unzipping, so it doesn't allow for such a good air movement, like if you are growing it in conventional greenhouse, which got more vent and levers when it sort of gets the flow of the air from the side. But still, so we're opening the greenhouse in the morning after the cold night. So usually, so when mid-morning when the sun starts shining, so just the temperatures will rise rapidly. It would be quite interesting. Always I tell people, get your minimum, maximum thermometer, and you would be astonished how hot it got. Yesterday in my greenhouse, and it's really well ventilated, got to 45 degrees, which I would expect in midsummer. When it comes to growing vegetables in it, so peas, they are sort of a bit hardier, though they will appreciate a bit of a cover when you are starting them on. So they will like it. However, they will not like the heat. So runner and French beans, they are a little bit more tender, a little bit more fussy. They like to be warm, but again, just that the heat will damage them. So it's quite difficult to, especially in a small space, to cater for all vegetables at the same time. So probably putting especially the peas outside during the day and letting them used to the outdoor condition, and just when the night is cold, just putting them inside. With the French beans, you have to be a little bit more careful because just they don't like it when it goes under 10 degrees. So you can keep them longer in the undercover. And as Jon mentioned, so I don't plant them until the end of May. In my case, I generally wait for the bank holiday weekend. In May, it's usually the Chelsea weekend, when I'm sort of brave enough to plant everything out, but I'm still there ready with the fleece. So we're watching the forecast and see if I have to cover something. When it comes to watering, so it's better, so in the greenhouse situation, I find better to water, so either in the morning, so especially early in the season when we get a cold night. So if you water in the morning, by the afternoon, just the humidity will subside. So just you will not get really cold and humid environment in the greenhouse. If you cannot do it in the morning, try to do it so mid-afternoon, but don't do it too late. So after you watered, leave the greenhouse open for the humidity, so that just to dissipate a bit, so just you don't get this sort of a cold and wet environment for the night.
Yeah, it is, as we were saying, the temperature fluctuations this year have been really difficult, haven't they, to manage with your vegetable crops in and out. Question 14, Amy Goddard from Norfolk. I have bushes of black currants, red currants and white currants, and treat them all the same by pruning out a proportion of old wood in winter. The black currants always seem to hold much more fruit. What am I doing wrong with the red and the white currants? So Jim, what would be your thoughts on that?
Well, the reasons probably behind this there is the way they crop. So black currants tend to carry most of their fruit on the young wood, the wood made the previous year. And so they're usually grown as a stalled bush, where you cut out a proportion of the older wood, usually a quarter to a third each year. So they've got a number of stems from ground level, and you take out a proportion, and they'll grow well like that. The red and white currants carry a lot of their fruit on the base of the previous year's wood, but also on the older wood, on the framework. So they're not always grown that way. They tend to be grown as a permanent framework, where you'd be pruning laterals back to a couple of buds in the winter, keeping the centre fairly open as an open-centred bush. You can grow them as a stalled bush in the same way as a black currant, but if you do, you wouldn't be taking out as much each year as you would with a black currant. Otherwise, you'd get probably to the situation here where they've probably been taking rather too much out of the red and white currants. So certainly you could go over to spur pruning them, cutting back the laterals on the red and white currants, but you could still do replacement pruning, but certainly not as much. So that's why the black currants would be performing better.
Lenka, how do you deal differently with red and white currants to black currants?
Yeah, just I do the sort of similar thing, just black currants, so you don't have to do much thinking about it. Look at the wood, it looks pretty old, starts flake, it gets a chop, really close to the base, so which encourages the growth from lower down. This is the reason black currants are one of the few things that you would plant slightly deeper than the soil level in the pot, because just they produce good strong shoots from low down. Then with the red and white currants, so I tend to do some of my pruning in summer. I have the permanent framework, what we mean, so they're just also like 5 fingers, so they're just the main branches, and so I prune the side shoots. It's for 2 things. So they encourage more of the flowering buds forming, as well as actually it's good for controlling the currant blister aphid. So just it causes this puckering and red with the red tinges on the new shoots, on the new foliage. So by shortening the shoots, the side shoots, so I will control the growth, encourage fruiting, as well as get rid of the aphid, because there's no point trying to spray it or anything. Just the leaves are puckered, the damage is done, and you would not do really anything. So I find it as a good way how I control it. It doesn't affect fruiting, because you are only nipping at the new growth, which doesn't carry fruit.
So basically, just be a little bit less harsh with your red currants and white.
Yeah, exactly. So just it's pinching on the red currants rather than going for the cicadas and taking chunks out. Don't get me wrong, over time on all bushes it's good to remove some of the older wood and let some of the shoots, don't pinch them, and just let them develop as a replacement, because just the wood over time will get tired, basically, like we all do, and needs a bit of rejuvenation.
And again, we've got step-by-step guides to this on our website.
Absolutely, yeah, just have a look on our website.
Yeah. Okay, so Mary Rickett from the Wirral. I can only grow in pots. Other people manage veg, but I have never had success. I try to grow runner beans in big pots and have also tried mixed salad leaves in grow bags. How can I successfully grow both these things? The garden faces south, but with high hedges, so all parts of the garden are shaded for parts of the day. Jon, what would you recommend Mary does to improve her vegetable growing?
Well, I'm a great advocate of growing in pots, and I think to our Chelsea exhibits, all the veg there in our Chelsea exhibits are grown in pots. The key thing is start early, grow a sturdy plant, and actually bring it on quietly and slowly. Give the plant, don't force the plants at any particular time. I think there's always a tendency to actually rush into things. Just get the timing right to start with. The other key thing is root run. I believe firmly that the key to good plants are good root systems. We don't see the root systems. So the answer to a good, if you think back to the old gardeners' adages around here and all throughout the UK, it's the answer lies in the soil. So good compost with plenty of organic matter in it, bit of slow release feed in it if you've got some, and quite honestly, those are the keys. And pot successionally. Start with a small pot, build the root system, and actually incrementally move it on. With runner beans again, we did some very early this year, and the other ones that we've done that a little bit later have caught up with them. They're about 5 feet on the canes at the moment, but they're all in protected situations. I won't move those out until probably the end of May, as I previously said. One other little tip, which might really help you, and I've mentioned horticultural fleece, which acts as a thermal screen, and that's really good. But the other thing we tend to use, and bear in mind we're largely organic as well, is we tend to use a green netting to stop the smaller insects and pests getting through to the plants. So we shroud those and grow them in a sort of box situation to avoid pests particularly. So those are a few tips, but growing veg in pots and containers, I think, is something for the future, particularly in towns and where you've got very small gardens and even windowsills. We've got to grow our own more and more and more now.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd probably add to that, Mary, is that as you've got quite a lot of shade in your garden, find the point that has the most afternoon sun, maybe particularly for your runner beans, because they do like that as much sunshine as you can give them. So just find the spot in your garden that during the summer gets the most afternoon sun it can possibly have, and I think that would probably be a big help with your runner beans. So hopefully you'll have more success this year. Question 16. I have 2 newly planted in March 2-tier Espalier apple trees. Is now the time of year to prune the vertical stem to start creating a 3rd tier? If not, when is the best time? So Jim, what would you recommend with this?
Well, I expect these trees have got 2 lower tiers and then a stem going straight up. So that will be used to train the next tier. And hopefully the wire work is already in place, because you need to be able to train them out onto wires. The time to do this would be in the dormant season, probably actually at March when they were planted, pruning back to just below the wire, which is about 45 centimeters, 18 inches above the tier, the topmost tier at the moment. Making sure there's 3 good buds where you're pruning, because you want to be choosing 1 bud to go left, 1 bud to go right, and 1 to go straight up, assuming you're going to produce a 4th tier. But if you didn't do it then, I would actually do it now, because there is still time. So I would prune it, say just below that wire. Now you'll get 3 shoots. Ideally, you want to train them 1 on either side at about 45 degrees. So fix bamboo canes across the wires. You can usually fix them between the wires to do that, and then train those shoots at 45 degrees on either side, and another cane going straight up to train the extension growth going straight up. Train them in during the summer and then lower them into position in the autumn, the 2 at 45 degrees. The reason you do this, and you can do the same for the extension growth on the arms of the Espalier, is if you try to prune them, tie them in flat straight away, they'll either stop growing or start to curve upwards. And if they grow too upright, the ones on either side, then you'll have a job to bend them in flat in the autumn. So 45 degrees and then lower on either side, and then the other one going straight up, and then you repeat the process for however many tiers you want to have, which is commonly 3, 4, 5 tiers on an espalier. That would be the normal number. Most I've seen is 22 on an espalier, which is up the end wall of a Victorian house with a pair. But that wouldn't be what you'd normally do, but the procedure would be exactly the same.
Okay, thanks for that, Jim. That's brilliant. Question 17 is Elizabeth from Southport. Thank you for all your helpful advice. I'm really enjoying Virtual Chelsea. I enjoy growing my own veg, but never do very well when growing from seed. This year, I have managed to grow some seedlings, peas, beans, courgettes, and peppers, which grew quickly in the first week, but in the last 2 weeks haven't grown anymore and haven't produced any more leaves. Whereas the seedlings I bought from a garden centre pre-lockdown are doing very well and have grown a lot. What am I doing wrong with my poor little seeds? Lenka, what do you think is the problem there?
It would be it's difficult to sort of suggest because we don't know how they will grow. But presuming the homegrown seedlings were sort of nicely pricked out and they are enjoying individual pots, it's possible that they are sort of slightly running out of feed. So, or their pot is far too small, because some people prick out in very little pots or very small cells. So by now, I would think like peppers, they should be at least in 9 centimeter pots. So just they might be lacking a bit of a root run, because generally speaking, the seedlings, if you buy things like peppers from a shop, they are already potted up in the 9 centimeter pot. They could be starting to lack light as well. So just trying to take them outside during the day, let them adjust to the outdoor conditions gradually, because if you put them out straight away, they get scorched. So again, watering. So if you water the larger plants the same as the smaller plants, you might be actually overwatering your seedlings, because they got smaller roots. So just they might be sitting in water. So, or on the other hand, underwatering. So I find that if I'm not sure how well watered my pot is, so just the one thing is touching the compost, and the other thing is actually pick it up. And the weight of the compost over time, just you get the knack of it, oh, it's perfect, doesn't need any water. Oh yeah, I think I've overdone it, or this needs more water. She could try and swim a little bit of gentle feeding, with things like Phostogen or Miracle-Gro, but just don't make the solution too strong. Just stick to it. Twice as much is not twice as good for the plant.
No, in fact, it's twice as bad, isn't it, in a lot of cases? And actually, that may, as Lenka says, I think, be part of the problem. When you've bought the ready-grown seedlings, obviously they're in a commercial quality compost, and they may have a slow-release fertiliser in, and they were grown in perfect conditions. And so, don't sort of think that your seedlings are doing terribly. They just might be a bit later, and it does sound like they need a bit of a feed, gentle feed, to maybe
a little bit of care. They should pick up and be fine.
Right, that's all we've got time for, I think, actually. So the topic for tomorrow's session is wildlife and the garden environment. So if you've got any questions about how to encourage wildlife to come into your garden, and how to garden in an environmentally friendly way, how to choose plants for difficult places, head to the Virtual Chelsea area of the RHS website and send in your questions. The advice team tomorrow will be joined by garden designer Chris Beardshaw. So thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.